Welcome, everybody. This is, as Kim mentioned this morning, in this room is the place where we're going to have, over the course of the day, lectures about science, focusing on the research that we've been doing at the Coffee Science Foundation, and a lot of it underscores and is inspired by a lot of the concepts that we've been talking about. I'm thrilled to see you all today. Feel free to come up close if you'd like. There's still a few soft chairs left. So we'll be doing this cold brew conversation this morning, and then talking about other scientific research concepts over the course of the day. So please join us all day. So for this first session, I would like to welcome to the stage two colleagues that I enjoy working with. The first is Julia Leach of Toddy. Please give her a warm welcome.
Thanks, Peter.
And also Professor Bill Ristenpart from the UC Davis Coffee Center. Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
So let's have a seat and sort of talk about what we're going to talk about. We wanted to bring information about this research project to this venue, and you'll hear a little bit about how RICO is actually a part of the history of this research. So anyway, we wanted to bring a report, and the question was how to do it. Do you have, some of the researchers talking? And Julia had the idea that since this research was so connected with RICO, and RICO is so much about conversation and interaction and involvement by the community, that why not frame it as a sort of a team effort, and also a conversation about how we did this thing, why we did this thing, and what we learned. So Julia helped us frame this conversation, as a RICO conversation, and so that's how we're going to present it today. So we've got a few topics of conversation for each of us to share with you all, and then at the end, what we'd like to do is invite you all to join us in maybe asking questions and exploring a little further. How's that sound? Thanks, guys. Welcome. Okay, so let's talk about how it started. I think maybe Julia, you can give a little bit of a history from your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And we all have very different perspectives on all of these questions, and that's one of the reasons I'm really excited to have this conversation. I've been in cold brew since 2010. And actually a little bit earlier than that, when I started working with Toddy. And it wasn't until 2014, 2015 that everyone kind of knew what cold brew was.
Right.
And so I remember when you called me and invited me to present at RICO, and was it 2016?
2016, yeah.
And it was really the first opportunity that it seemed like the specialty coffee industry, Specialty Coffee Association, was taking cold brew seriously, or maybe considering taking it seriously. Mm-hmm. And I don't remember the exact title, but it was something about cold brew, a category or a craze.
That's
yeah. There we go. And several different presenters, you invited us to talk about different aspects of cold brew. And my chat was about cold brew as a sensory opportunity, and cold brew as a brewing method to really help us discover new flavors in coffee that we may not have had a chance to taste before. And that there was so much about cold brew that we didn't know yet, but we knew it was interesting, and we knew we wanted to learn more. And I remember in prepping that conversation, you and I had an opportunity to talk about how research was done in this space. And at the time, there was, some big companies that were doing their own R&D, learning some insights and keeping it as proprietary,
right.
Sometimes even patenting it. Mm-hmm. And it got to the point where it seemed like people in smaller businesses or even baristas who wanted to learn more just didn't have access to this information. And then it started to become disseminated in almost like marketing strategies. And I remember one of the other presenters was talking about, cold brew was just whatever anyone wanted to call a cold beverage that they wanted to sell. And it just seemed like it was going in a very odd direction, and people really needed some foundational knowledge, and the industry needed to be able to answer some of these questions. And so we talked about, it'd be great if someday someone would do this research and collaborate and share it. Wouldn't that be great? Who's ever going to do that? I don't know, but we can wish and hope. And then in 2019, you called me up again and said, "Hey, Julia, let's do it." So
we'll
that's kind of how it started.
We'll talk about that moment in a minute, but I do want to focus, as you did, on 2016. That seems to be sort of a watershed year for cold brew in a lot of different ways. So let's dwell on 2016 at the RICO. As Julia said, we were asking questions about cold brew at that time. And there was exactly a lot of confusion about what cold brew was, how it fit in with the specialty coffee movement. Cold brew has been around for a long time, right? I mean, Toddy, I think, started in the 60s
Toddy's been around since the early 1960s, but Toddy didn't invent cold brew. It's been around for, some say, centuries.
So the process had been around for a long time, but for some reason it started to get really relevant in 2015, enough so that in RICO, we were, as you guys I think are probably all aware, at RICO we like to bring up to the surface the salient topics at the moment, and it was really clear that cold brew was one of those topics that year. So we had this session called cold brew, category or craze, and in my introduction to the session, I used a similar graphic to this, but it was from the 2016 period. But it's even more interesting, I think, now. So these are Google trend searches. And what I did was I put in iced coffee and cold brew, knowing that there was this connection that people were identifying between cold brew as a preparation technique and iced coffee as a beverage, just to see what the relationship was in terms of Google searches. And you can see, that line, that vertical line, represents 2016. So you can see that, let's look at iced coffee first. Every summer there's a peak of interest in searches for iced coffee. That's why it looks like a heartbeat or something like that. That's the heartbeat of iced coffee. And every summer our heart beats faster for iced coffee. And then you can see below it, and you can see that iced coffee, from a Google perspective, there's increasing interest every year. That the trend is going upward, so that's interesting. And that's a well-known, now at this point, that's well-known that interest in cold coffees generally has risen year over year. Then the second one is search term cold brew. So as you can see, it's very flat up until the 2010s, and then suddenly people start to get interested in it. And then the third one at the bottom is iced coffee in blue, superimposed over cold brew in red. And something really interesting happens. So leading up to in the years before 2016, you can see that interest in cold brew seems to be sort of pushing up interest in iced coffee. It's coming up below it, but it may be, and we speculated at the time that maybe interest in cold brew was actually driving interest in iced coffee. And the interesting thing, it was that summer, a few months after our session, searches of cold brew for the first time overtook searches for iced coffee, and have been higher every year since. So we didn't know it at the time in spring of 2016, but cold brew was about to overtake iced coffee in the minds of many consumers, and at least in terms of their revealed searches on the internet. This is something I think that probably all of us experienced in one way or another. You know, Julie, I'm sure your company experienced sort of a rapid growth in that time. I know that I think our question really became answered in terms of whether it was a category or a craze in the years after that. We asked the question, we talked about it. We sort of settled on, yeah, this feels like it's a permanent thing. And indeed, that has turned out to be true. Bill, something else happened in 2016,
It did.
the same year. So why don't you tell us about it?
Yeah, so it's fascinating for me. I'm a professor of chemical engineering. I went to that, Rico. I remember sitting and watching the talk, and I think it was that conference that really pulled me into the Specialty Coffee Association and this community, because I saw that there's really interesting scientific questions. And so as a little background, what you're looking at here, this is a timeline of the UC Davis Coffee Center. I got into coffee as a teaching thing. I just wanted to use coffee because I love coffee. I wanted to use coffee to teach science and engineering. But in 2016, that's when we got a founding gift from Pete's Coffee to found the UC Davis Coffee Center. And since then, we've been growing a whole curriculum. We've been doing really cool research. Right now, the other one that's highlighted is 2023. We're actually renovating the Coffee Center building to facilitate advanced education and research focused on coffee, including, most importantly, cold brew coffee, right? That year, 2016, was really seminal because that really triggered, for me at least, a switch from just really teaching to doing research. And so I was delighted to partner with the Specialty Coffee Association and the Coffee Science Foundation. And we've done a whole bunch of different research projects. We did a really deep dive on the coffee brew and control chart. The cold brew research, which we're building up to, that started, I think it was, in my mind, really triggered. I started thinking about it based on that same Rico talk about, craze or category.
Yeah.
And then that's led to a whole bunch of really cool research and supporting a lot of really great students to work on cold brew coffee.
Yeah.
I
think we actually had a food scientist talk in that session that day, because we were asking these questions about what were the material differences between cold brew and hot brew, what were the sensory differences between cold brew, and everybody had opinions, right? And so we were already turning to science, but as I recall, that presentation wound up bringing up maybe more questions than answers. And I remember having a conversation with you about it, Bill, afterwards. It's like, yeah.
So that again, that presentation catalyzed me to do what academics do. We start diving through the academic literature, looking for what's the current state on cold brew. And one of the realities about coffee is that historically it has not really benefited from intense academic investigation. So at UC Davis, there's a whole department of viticulture and enology that does wine. There's a whole program on beer. Historically, there's not been anything on coffee, and not just at UC Davis, anywhere else. So when I went in to look at the literature, looking at cold brew, I found probably the most neutral way of saying is that there was a lot of confusion in the literature in the way that people were asking questions about, lots of papers about, is cold brew more acidic than hot brew, or vice versa? And like lots of papers that, tried tackling that, did a few measurements, but there wasn't, in my opinion, anything that was really systematic and rigorous that really tackled that question head on.
Okay, so Bill's starting to think, at this point, Bill's starting to think about cold brew from a research perspective. And Julia is always thinking about cold brew, I think.
Yeah, we were always thinking about cold brew, obviously, but a shift occurred in our business, customer service, just day-to-day conversations where for years people could just take our word for it. We had many years of anecdotal evidence, and we had done various lab trials, submitted to a third-party lab to answer specific questions. But we started getting questions that we knew kind of with our own experience what the answer was, but that wasn't good enough anymore.
Right.
I remember having some really in-depth conversations and citing, we've done this trial, and they said, but what about the data?
Right.
But have you inoculated it? And all sorts of
Right.
questions that had never been relevant before.
Right.
And we realized that there were questions that not only did we need to be able to answer, but everyone needed to have more confidence and also be on the same page.
Right.
And counter to that, there were more and more people spreading their own information about cold brew that we knew wasn't right, but we didn't have any data to back that up.
Yeah, so in
it was frustrating.
Yeah, totally. In preparation for this this talk, I went to the internet and pulled out some infographics about cold brew coffee just at random. And sometimes these things contradict each other, Sometimes, and I think those of us who work in coffee realize that some of these claims are maybe questionable, and they certainly seem to be based on anecdote rather than evidence, which is what you're saying. We need data, and what we have is lots of people with opinions. So some of the misconceptions that we identified as we were thinking about this is that may have been, they were conceptions, they may be misconceptions or not. These are things that people, that were out there.
Mm-hmm.
So were these, this list, you mainly put together this list. Are these are things that people would come to you with?
These are things that we discovered were being shared pretty broadly.
Right.
Not necessarily with malintent, but the top one, and it was actually at RICO in the scientific perspective, where the presenter said cold brew has the same chemical composition as coffee brewed with heat. And I remember I followed that presentation, and I knew that wasn't the
right,
same,
yeah.
because of a lot of the research that we had done, but I couldn't put my finger on it.
Right.
And so I remember having to modify my speech a little bit to say, okay, well, maybe there's the same chemical compounds, but they're in different ratios.
Right,
There's got to be something different. But so that was one. Chilled coffee is the same as cold brew, and therefore cold brew is just a marketing term. Again, we knew that to be very different. Again, and we had done, some of our own sensory panels in SCA Expo, I think 2 or 3 years before. We actually did a panel about that. But again, that was fairly anecdotal. And this was one that we actually still get quite a bit. That cold brew, nothing's further extracted after 2 hours of full immersion. And I remember talking to Bill and saying, I got to know if this is true, because some very sophisticated sciencey people are spreading this information, and I need to know if I'm wrong. And he said, well, we gotcha. And cold brew lacks flavor complexity. I think there was an article several years ago where cold brew was called diner coffee. And I don't think that was a very positive explanation of it, but that it was just kind of meh. And that all cold brew was that way. And that also cold brew lacks aroma. That there's nothing volatile and interesting about how it smells. And so those were some of the things that we knew weren't true, but we couldn't say why.
Right. So, and there was similar confusion maybe in the academic literature at the same time, right, Bill?
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so it's easy to go find papers that will make claims that cold brew has less acid than hot brew, or vice versa, okay? But you, as Julia just alluded to, you really got to pay attention to the details of the extraction. And so that's why we started building up this research project to really do it rigorously and carefully. I mean, so one of the main confounding factors for the first one, cold brew is the same chemical composition as coffee brewed with heat. That's absolutely not true. Our data shows that very clearly. But you can find people making that claim, and you can find people not making that claim. So the literature is confused. There's a lot of confusion, or there was back at that point in time.
So now 2016 has turned to 2017 and 18, and the coffee center is growing, and Toddy is growing. And one of the cool things about my job, both as a RICO person and also in my role as the executive director of the Coffee Science Foundation, is I get to sort of provide a link between the academic research community, in this case represented by Bill and the UC Davis Coffee Center, and the industry who is powerfully interested in gathering evidence. As you've heard Julia say, you know, she was hungry for actual evidence as a business person to back up some of the claims that she felt were true about her product, and also to maybe clarify some of the misconceptions that were out there in the marketplace. And I've got to say, I just admire that so much when people who are in the trade want to step up and gather evidence around their product. You know, I was thinking about this yesterday as we were talking about product marketing, and in a couple of the talks, it was expressed that, you know, consumers often have distrust of products because they feel like, you know, you say it's a marketing term. You know, I think consumers often feel like, am I just being marketed to? Are there claims being made that can't be backed up? And I think consumers get overwhelmed by that.
Well,
and
even in the scientific literature, there was an article that said, you know, these cold brew companies are lying to you.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I said, Bill, I'm not lying to people.
Yeah. I remember that article. I won't call it by name, but like that was a great example of a paper where they did not think carefully about the confounding factors of the extraction.
Right.
Yeah.
So
anyway, from my perspective, Julia, one of the things that happened was Toddy became one of the supporters of the UC Davis Coffee Center, which was amazing and awesome, and that other companies that are here are invited to do. I think Bill would be grateful for that support. But also at the same time, the three of us started to talk about doing an actual research project. Like, what would actually doing a focused research project on cold brew look like? And Bill, you can hear in Bill's description that he was thinking about experimental design and outcomes, and Julia was thinking about, well, what would that mean for Toddy? And then in the very last moments of 2019, as I recall, I got an email from Julia saying, we're ready. We really want to support this research. And so that was a cool moment we were all filled with excitement that we were going to launch a multi-year investigation into the chemistry and the sensory attributes of cold brew coffee. So, we're thinking, and 2019 is closing, 2020 is going to be the best year ever. And then 2020 happened. So we had launched the research project, had announced it, and then things got complicated for us, didn't they? In early 2020, as we all know, COVID emerged, and it complicated all of our lives, but including the research side. And I remember some anxious, let's say, phone calls between the three of us thinking, what are we going to do? Should we put this on hold until we understand a little bit more, or should we go forward? And ultimately, I think all of us, Julia and Bill, both of you, really were clear about, no, we really need to proceed with this. What were you thinking in those moments, Julia?
Well, you know, the presenter yesterday talked about what you know you know, and what you know you don't know. And this was something we didn't know what we didn't know. And in some ways that ended up being a positive, because if we had known at the end of 2019 what was about to happen, I wouldn't have signed that check. Right. You know, I was just like, oh no, it's way too risky. Right. But because we had signed the contract and we had, you know, enlisted grad students, and you know, this was a critical part of their education, their livelihood. We couldn't just say, oh yeah, we'll just deal with it later. Yeah. And learning how to navigate the jungle ahead of us was almost like a different member of the project. You know, the pandemic created some difficulties, but also pushed us into some opportunities that we never would have explored had it not been for the challenges of the pandemic.
Right. So just to explain to you all how this system works, what happens is the Coffee Science Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit, a charity that exists to support coffee research. And the way that we are funded is through, we don't get any government funding or anything like that. What we get is support from our industry. And in this case, Julia and Toddy gave the Coffee Science Foundation a gift that was restricted to the investigation of cold brew coffee. And so when Coffee Science Foundation gets a gift like that, we turn to the research community, and we use those funds to support the research community. In this case, the UC Davis Coffee Center, and so, Bill, why don't you tell us what happens when a grant like that is made, and how you gear up to do the actual research?
There's often a lot of misconceptions about what that money's supporting, and the number one thing it supports is students. So you already alluded to that. Like, what we do with the funding is we support the stipend and the tuition of graduate students to tackle the research. So they're the ones in the lab actually doing the research, and so.
And who are these students?
Graduate students.
Yeah.
And there's actually a couple of them here. So I don't know if Kenzie Batali is in the. Is Kenzie, I can't see. She's one of the people working one of the sensory immersion experiences. Mm-hmm. I think Juliet Hahn is here as well. Mm-hmm. But this project, this gift supported several students. So there's also Sarah Yeager, who ended up working at Toddy, and then also Jesse Lang, who's giving a lecture at the expo later this weekend. Plus a whole ecosystem of undergraduates. And so we have, those are all, I just mentioned, graduate students. You know, they're getting their master's or their PhD, focused on doing cutting edge coffee science research. But we also have undergraduates who are getting their first taste of research. They're working as assistants, taking a lot of measurements. And so this support, ultimately from Toddy through the Coffee Science Foundation, really enabled a whole bunch of academic talent pipeline development. And so that's one of the main goals for the Coffee Center. And it wouldn't be possible without the support of forward-thinking companies like Toddy and others who support the Coffee Center.
Well, and just a quick mention, I think in 2016, we had this conversation about, you know, these companies just need to step up and collaborate. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I didn't have any notion that we would be able to fund research. And when it came time to answer the question if we wanted to be a part of this project, it was a, you know, put your money where your mouth is, Julia, situation. And, you know, we could have invested that money in our own proprietary research and kept it for ourselves. And it was an opportunity to say, no, we're going to do this for the community, and cross our fingers and hope that it yields some of the results that we want. But we really have no idea because we don't control this project, and that was challenging.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. I had forgotten to mention that, but that's a really important thing about the Coffee Science Foundation, which is that when a donor like this supports research through the Coffee Science Foundation, the explicit sort of rules of how that works is we publish what we do. So many companies do proprietary research where they kind of keep it secret because they want to use it as a kind of competitive secret. But for the Coffee Science Foundation is a research arm of the Specialty Coffee Association, which exists to serve the entire industry. So we have, as part of our sort of rules of the game, is when there's research that's supported by the Coffee Science Foundation, it gets shared in venues like this one. We're sharing it now, and at the end of the talk, you'll have access to. I'll show you where to get some of the papers and articles and things that are written. There will be classes given at multiple events, and that's part of the deal.
Yeah, and even if the findings aren't favorable to the funding partners.
That's right. And that creates some risk.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think my sense is that you knew that the reward of more information was worth the small risk of negative unintended consequences, because there's also some potentially some positive
Right.
unintended consequences.
And one of the things that I really enjoyed about being part of this project was, again, you talked about some of the research that had been done, but not quite correctly. And we had seen that a lot, that presenters would have some data, and here's how they did the science. But oftentimes I thought, well, but they didn't consider how people actually brew, or they didn't consider things that we know is really important, things that we know are very important. And so we had the opportunity to help coach the research in terms of not mandating research, but say, hey, please consider this, please consider that, and we got to help recommend. I remember one of those opportunities was don't just brew with one coffee. You need different origins, and you need different roast profiles, because cold brew isn't one generic coffee. It's all sorts of different, it's a brewing method that can be used for a variety of different coffees, and we need to understand how factors such as roast profile and origin impact all of these questions. And so I was really happy that we had a chance to suggest some of those things.
And I should jump and say that one of the things that's very rewarding for me is learning how to take a lot of really awesome experience in the industry, and how do we translate that into something that's scientifically rigorous and make an experimental design that captures a lot of the things that are out there, perhaps anecdotally or perhaps confidentially, and really figure out how to put that on a statistically significant, rigorous level. And so that's, I really enjoy that two-way interaction with the industry.
Yeah. So from a practical perspective, the Coffee Science Foundation makes a grant to a research institution like UC Davis, and what Bill does is he starts to arrange the student support that's needed to achieve such a research project. In this case, he mentioned a master's student, one master's student, and a couple of PhD candidates who were working in food science or engineering, who were in the realm of already working or interested in coffee and had the skills needed to actually do this investigation. But a PhD candidate or a master's student needs number one, they need a project to work on that they can do, which a project like this can provide. But then they also need support as they do it. And when I say support, I mean like support for their living expenses. This is something that not everybody knows about grad students is as Bill alluded to already, this money goes to, it becomes sort of their job to do this research, and this is how they pay their rent.
No, yeah, absolutely. So a lot of people think of graduate school as kind of like medical school or law school, where the individual student pays a lot of money, takes out loans or whatever to do that. In the sciences and engineering is very different. Like we, the professors, have to come up with support to help support the students, pay their stipend, pay their tuition. And that's why research like this is expensive, because we're paying for all that, paying their stipend, paying that, on top of all the costs for the supplies and recruiting panels and all that stuff. And that's, if we didn't have support from the Coffee Science Foundation and companies like Toddy, we wouldn't be doing coffee research. It just wouldn't be happening.
Right. And so it wouldn't be able to happen.
Yeah.
So Bill had already geared up in early 2020 to do this research, and then COVID happened. So we all had to decide, what are we going to do? And Bill made it very clear, look, we've already committed to these grad students that they're going to be able to do this. Can we continue? And all of us decided that we needed to, but we couldn't do it the normal way, or they couldn't do the research the normal way, so they had to figure out how to do it under different circumstances.
Yeah, so absolutely. Like one of the luxuries for me of being at UC Davis is I have tremendously talented colleagues, and so I should mention I was doing this work in collaboration with Professor Jean-Xavier Guinard. I had excellent grad students who were like Kenzie Batali, Dr. Batali, who's here, who were able to, on the fly, just switch things around. So a standard sensory descriptive panel, like what do? You bring everybody into a room and taste, and we could not do that. And so what you're looking at here on the slide is what our lab looked like for quite a long time. It was filled with mason jars, right? And so what we were doing is we modified the protocol to brew all these different coffees under different conditions, put them in mason jars, and then drive them all over town. So for a while, I was working as a poorly paid Uber Eats driver, delivering mason jars to our panel, which was distributed. And then we were doing all the sensory panel over Zoom. So we had to modify our sensory descriptive work to do it
and it happened
remotely.
Quickly. It happened so quickly because everyone was motivated. Like we're doing this. We didn't change the project outline. And so it was your job to figure out how to get it done.
Yeah, and I should emphasize that this was not a weekend project. So like we did something called a 3 by 3 by 3 factorial design, which what that means 3 different origins. So we did a wet hold coffee, a honey coffee, and a washed coffee. Each of those was roasted to 3 different roast levels, so light, medium, and dark. And each of them was brewed. The whole point of the study was to figure out what's the effective brew temperature. So we brewed each of those. So 3 by 3 by 3, that's 27 sample types. And then you do it in triplicate, so now you're up to 81. You have I think we did about 30 different sensory descriptive attributes. So, you know, sour, bitter, floral, rubbery. They had an expert panel of about 12. And so the number of data points just balloons.
Right. And then number of poorly paid Uber Eats.
Yes, exactly. The number of deliveries we have to do.
So what you see here in this picture is on the right, you see jars, and you can see the codes on the top, right? Those are the treatments that you're talking about. So each one of those has some either cold brew or hot brew coffee or room temperature brewed coffee.
And let me jump in and clarify that. So I kept mentioning confounding factors. And so you can take the same coffee, all right, and taste it when it's hot and just let it cool down. It's going to taste differently. You're going to perceive it differently. And so one of the main confounding factors that we wanted to very carefully control for is the serving temperature. So everything was served at 4 degrees Celsius at fridge temperature, right? And so we're trying to answer the scientific question. How is chilled hot brew different from true cold brew, right? And so as part of that, another confounding factor is the total dissolved solids, or the strength. So if you hot brew, very quickly you get a high concentration, right? So if you have now cold brew at a low TDS and a hot brew at a high TDS, you're not necessarily tasting the difference in the effective temperature, you're just tasting the difference in strength.
Right.
And so those jars, what we went through is a tremendous amount of effort to brew them at different temperatures fully to full extraction, and then dilute them to all the same TDS. So we're really serving everything at the same strength and the same serving temperature. Remove those confounding factors and really identify what the impact of the brew temperature was on that.
Right.
And very hard to do with mason jars, delivering it all over town.
Amazing. Yeah. And then on the left, you can see a picture, and those are sensory references that are used to train the panelists. And so that there are, even though they're working in different rooms in different places because they're separated because of COVID, but they're using the same reference to mean lemon or vanilla or chocolate or rubber or floral. And that requires a whole other project, right? To package up all those references and give a complete set of references to every panelist. So you can see the amount of prep work that went into doing this. So we've done a lot of pre-talk here about how we got to the place of doing this. I wanted to mention one more thing that happened during the COVID period was another kind of research that we've just talked about, the sensory research, but there's another kind of research that can happen in a project like this, which has to do with surveying the available literature. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So one of the questions, or one of the claims out there is, cold brew is less acidic than hot brew, or vice versa. You can find different people saying different things. We wanted to find out more about the acid composition in coffee. And so I think many in this room know that there's chlorogenic acids and different types of organic acids present in coffee. And so because we couldn't go in the lab and start doing measurements right away, we did what scientists refer to as a meta-analysis of the literature. And that's most famous in medical journals where you look at different pharmaceutical interventions and things like that. We did this with one of our master's students, a very talented master's student, Sarah Yeager, right there, and I think starting in April 1st of 2020, we kind of switched on a dime. Okay, instead of going to the lab, let's just find every single academic paper we can get our hands on that has any measurement of any acid in any coffee, and let's compile that into a database. And Sarah did a fantastic job of that. She, I think, ended up transcribing more than 8,000 more than 8,000 individual chemical acid concentration measurements from like 150 papers or something.
Yeah.
And we compiled that into a massive review paper, which is now been cited a tremendous number of times.
Yeah.
And so
well, and that's a good reference of the, turning lemons into lemonade. It's not that you didn't feel like going to the lab. It's that
we were not allowed to go to the
lab.
lab.
Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of the things that we thought would happen right away, you just couldn't do. And relying on some of the other departments, well, they couldn't lend out their lab either. And so, you had to keep her busy.
Yeah.
But this ended up being a really tremendous outcome of this project that none of us expected.
And I'm not sure how many people in this audience are aware about the power of a meta-analysis study like Bill just referenced. So as he mentioned, what a meta-analysis does is it takes a lot of other experiments, other research, and compiles that information into a meta, so another level of evidence. So it takes all these individual data points and experiments and combines the learnings from those. And because of that combination, it's much more powerful evidence than a single study would be, because you're combining the power of all of the studies. So as far as evidence goes, a meta-analysis is seen as the sort of the highest bar of evidence in the medical world, and it's for that reason that, as Bill mentioned, that meta-analysis that Sarah did has been published and has gotten a lot of citations because it's seen as very persuasive, powerful evidence just about acidity in coffee. Meanwhile, we in the Specialty Coffee Association, who are teaching classes about acidity in coffee, realized we have much better information about how acids manifest in coffee, both hot brew and cold brew and all kinds of coffee. And it transformed the way that we teach about acidity in coffee. And I myself personally, having taught about acidity in coffee for 20 years, learned a tremendous amount from this work. And this was all information that was out there, but it just never been compiled and put together. And Sarah was able to do that because of this project. So this project not only taught us about cold brew, it also taught us about acidity in coffee writ large, which was a really neat outcome that we didn't expect when we started. So that's one of the things that we learned. We have an entire paper about acids in coffee. I'll give you a link to it later. So that's one thing that we learned. But sort of as a top line of some of the things that we learned was, as we suspected, there are indeed, turns out that there are meaningful differences, sensory differences between hot and cold brew. This is something that I think intuitively we coffee people know. But there was some skepticism about that idea, which is what Julie was referring to. But you'll see some of the evidence about what we find there. And Bill and his team found meaningful chemical differences between hot and cold brew, which makes sense. If there's chemical differences, there's likely to be sensory differences and vice versa. So yeah. They also discovered, by surprise, that there were also color differences, and I'll ask Bill to talk about that in a second. And then, as we were just talking about, we developed a much richer understanding of both organic and chlorogenic acids in coffee. So, Bill, let's talk a little bit about the sensory and chemistry a little bit here. Here's a rainbow of data. Can you tell us what we're looking at here?
Yeah, I hope you guys are ready to geek out. We're going to get in the weeds here for a second. So what you're looking at on the left is a graph of one of many different sensory attributes that we looked at. So that's sourness, okay? And so low values are low sourness, perceived sourness from our sensory descriptive panel, high values are higher sourness. And then the different codes there on the bottom, each little graph refers to a different origin or a different roast level, okay? And the colors represent different temperatures. So blue is refrigerator temperature, green is room temperature, red is hot. And you can see there's a few trends there. The ones that are way lower, not surprisingly, those are the dark roasts. So like dark roast just has less perceived sourness. And I should emphasize that our panels were tasting everything blind. They didn't know what they're tasting, right? They just received a mason jar, and their job was to taste it. But if you look very carefully at the difference of the colors for any group of 3 next to each other, you can start seeing differences in the perceived sourness specifically for that origin and for that roast level as a function of the brew temperature. Again, when you very carefully controlled for the total dissolved solids and the serving temperature, right? And then the letters on top of each bar, those indicate this, like this is the things scientists have to worry about. It's the statistical significance or not, do it. If the letters are the same, there's no statistical significant difference. If they're different, then there is, okay?
Right.
And so the one on the left is all complicated. The one on the right, all right, that's when you kind of average over everything, all right? So you average, and this is, I was kind of astonished by this result. You average over all the roast levels, okay? You average over all the origins, and then you just ask, okay, what, even when you average over all those things, is still statistically significant? And it turned out that there were 4 sensory attributes that were statistically significantly different, even when you average over these pretty wildly different coffees and wildly different roast levels.
81 samples.
Yes, 27 different sample types, 81 total. And what were those 4? So we found that floral was higher in cold brew, okay? And then rubber, bitter, and sour were all statistically significantly higher in hot brew, okay? And again, this is at same serving temperature, same total dissolved solids. And so that is the take-home message, and that's the title of our paper. You know, cold brew is more floral and less rubbery, bitter, and sour than hot brew, right? Because that's what the data very clearly and very emphasizes very rigorously, statistically significantly showed that to be the case.
And these on the right here, as Bill is saying, these are averaged over many coffees, many origins, many roasts, and it's still showing an effect. These might seem like small effects, given these bars aren't wildly different from each other, but it is actually a large effect because you're averaging so many things together. You'd expect to see no effect. And one of the interesting things about that is, you mentioned that one of the preconceptions about cold brew coffee is that it's less aromatic than hot brewed coffee. Yet we see that the science tells us that floral, one of the key aromatics that we like a lot, is actually higher in cold brew coffee than it is in hot brewed chilled coffee, which that's the result that surprised me the most. Sour, I think we kind of expected. I think, that was consistent with the conventional wisdom, right? That cold brew is less sour than hot brewed coffee, and indeed we did see that. We also saw, particularly the room temperature brewed coffee was less bitter, averaged over all these things. I saw some people taking pictures of this slide. At the end, I'll give you a link to the paper that this chart is in. It's an open access article that you can dial in. And as Bill said, on the left there, that complicated one is all these specific coffees. So you can see how different roasts and different origins were affected differently. You also discovered something sort of by accident, right, Bill?
Yeah, so this is a photo I took with my cell phone. One of the undergraduates on the project, Ashley Thompson, I remember we're all wearing masks, and she came by and said, "Professor, the brews look kind of different." I mean, what do you mean? What do you mean they look different? And this is what we saw. So that what you're looking at on the left is a picture of some of our early work on the cold brew, and the right is the hot brew. And the thing, it's in a little microscope stand to really have the illumination there. And I was fascinated by this observation. Like, I hadn't heard anybody talk about the color of brewed coffee. Anybody who's roasted coffee knows that roasting, everybody talks about the color of your beans. What about the beverage? And in the world of wine, everybody obsesses about the color of the wine. And at least at that point in time, I hadn't heard anybody, at Rico or anywhere else, really talk about the color of beverage coffee. And so this was an early clue that, oh gosh, there's something about brew temperature that affects the color of the beverage itself. And that matters a lot if you're in the business of selling coffee, like what it looks like in the cup, what it looks like in a bottle of ready-to-drink coffee on the shelf. That's the first thing consumers see is the color. And there's been a lot of work that different colors, right, affect people's perceptions and their desire to purchase, different things. So we were intrigued by this. And so it was one of the things we didn't know. Mm-hmm. So we saw this and we thought, okay, like we're doing all this brewing, why don't we just measure the color systematically as well? And that became part of, again, Sarah Yeager's master's thesis as well.
And turned into a paper for her, right?
Yeah, so so Sarah was a great student. She published 2 papers for one master's thesis. And so a rule of thumb is that a master's is one kind of peer-reviewed publication, and she got 2. And so it's a real luxury for me to work with such talented students who can tackle 2 projects like that at once.
Yeah. Did you have any inkling that there was a color difference between cold brewed coffee and hot brewed coffee before this research, Julia?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I didn't.
I knew that there was a chemical difference.
Right.
And I really, really, really wanted to understand that.
Yeah.
I think every update call, I said,
what about the chemistry? Yeah.
What about the chemistry? And so when I saw this, I said, I knew it.
Yeah.
Because that just, that's not dye.
Right.
There's something going on there that must be chemistry related. At least that's what I wanted to believe.
Right.
And so when they decided to dig into it further, it was something I was really excited to hear about.
And it's plausible that some of the let's say compounds that are causing this color difference are also causing some of these sensory differences, right? Because there are color causing compounds that are perceptible from a sensory perspective.
Well, and I remember in that call, everyone was like, yeah, but were they filtered the same? Like, is there sediment in the cup? Or yeah, they're not to the same TDS. And everyone on the call like kept trying to strike it down. Like, no. There's got to be something fishy going on, and there wasn't.
Yeah. So this was an early result, and this is a very dramatic photo. And to address all those questions, we went and again set it up to do it as rigorously as possible. And so here's the results that actually got published. And when we present these on different projectors, what I've learned in this whole process is that color perception is very challenging, and the same image can look very different on different screens. But hopefully you guys can see that there's a difference in the color of these 6 different vials, which all represent different brew temperatures and different origins, seen in a couple different ways, either transmission mode through the vial or reflection mode looking into the bottom of a cup of coffee. And there are differences in color, just based on the brew temperature.
And these are, to be clear, these are all exactly the same TDS.
Exactly the same TDS, yeah.
Yeah, so it's what we're seeing here is effective brewing temperature, which is amazing. Mm-hmm. And even when you control for TDS. So
and roast and origin.
And roast and origin, yeah. It's amazing. Okay, so then the question is, okay, we've talked about what we've learned scientifically, and you've heard Bill talk a little bit about academic publications. There have so far, do you remember the number of academic publications that we're up to on this project?
So 3, okay, but then we have a bunch in the pipeline. So Jessie, who I mentioned before, she's writing a whole bunch more. We have one in peer review right now, and so that number is poised to skyrocket.
Yeah, okay. So already so far, there's been 3 academic publications. There are more in the pipeline, expect more. Our job at the Coffee Science Foundation is, these academic scientific publications are great, but sometimes they're not available to people if they're published by journals that require a subscription or something to access. Normal people can't get to them. But also they're written in a very characteristic language of academic or chemistry or sensory language that may not be accessible to us mere mortals in the trade. So part of our job in the Coffee Science Foundation is to try to develop plain language versions of the same research and make them available to the specialty coffee community. And so you can see, Bill talked about 3 academic publications. Here are 3 plain language explanations of those same 3 papers that appeared in the SCA's 25 magazine or online. And in fact, that one to the right, cold versus ice using sensory analysis, that's actually in the issue of 25 magazine that's available out there right now. So if you guys have picked up a copy of 25 magazine, that article is in there, and you can read it. It was written by Dr. Kenzie Batali, who we've mentioned a few times. She's here at the event, and she wrote a plain language version of the same paper that she published academically. So it's the same exact information, it's just presented in maybe a less confusing way for those of us that need to apply it in the trade.
And again, that's the whole reason, from the industry perspective, why we decided to fund this project is people need these outputs, and how does it relate to them as a coffee professional, or even to to their customers, their guests who are asking these questions. So this phase of the project is it's like Christmas morning.
Yeah, totally.
Just opening
it's
up
exciting.
These gifts that we can share.
Yeah, it is really nice. That's the exciting part for us too, is when we can present these gifts to the industry, and it's hard to overstate how important that is, and how much these actually contribute to our collective knowledge. Another place that this happens, another way that this happens, is at events like this one. You have, the scientist Bill, the cold brew expert Julia, and the sort of connector here on stage, but all throughout at Expo and other events, there have been lots of other presentations. Bill, some of the students that you've referred to, Mackenzie Batali, Sarah Yeager, and Jesse Liang, these are all people who either have already or presented in this work. And this is cool for us at the association because it provides real scientific content at these events. Which isn't that common. A lot of people in the industry will speculate about science and talk science-y things and stuff like that, but these are actual young scientists who are sharing their work with the community, and weren't coffee people often when they came to the university. But they got bit by the coffee bug while they're doing their education, and then become coffee scientists, which is like a really neat thing. Go ahead.
Let me do a shout out for Jessie, the woman on the bottom right there. She's giving a Expo lecture this Sunday at the Expo, and she's talking about a whole different project we did as part of that. Everything we talked about here was brewing to equilibrium, so fully extracting then diluting it all to the same TDS. Jessie also looked at the dynamics of flavor extraction during cold brew. So imagine taking a sample right after adding the water, and taking a sample a couple hours later, another sample 4 hours later, and doing sensory descriptive work on that as well. And so she's got fascinating data. I won't spoil it for you, but I recommend you go find her lecture on Sunday.
Which is also really important because, I remember having a conversation with Sarah when she was working with our team, and all of her coffee brewing had been in a lab, oh, okay. She's like, yeah, well, we brewed at equilibrium. Like, well, what is equilibrium? Like, well, it's when you can't extract anymore. Like, well, people don't necessarily prefer that type of a beverage. And so I love Jessie's project because it's very applicable to how people really brew. And some of the nuances of some of the things I like to present about of manipulating some of the variables such as brew time in order to get the flavor profiles that you want. And we had 27 times 3 samples. You couldn't necessarily do all of you couldn't do any more variables in the first project, but this one explores sensory and extraction in a way that is very applicable to the trade.
Yeah, okay. And then also, Toddy gives presentations and things at events like this one. And have you started to integrate these things into your talks that you give at these events?
I have, and it's nice to be able to cite data.
Yeah.
To say, okay, well, this is something that we've been exploring for years, and now here's a really cool piece of research that backs up what we knew or taught us something that we totally didn't expect. Or maybe in a couple instances, maybe we've been proven wrong.
Yeah.
And it's really fun to be able to talk about that as well.
So you have some talks coming up at Expo, right, and workshops?
Yeah, we've got a 3-hour cold brew workshop Friday afternoon, and then Saturday morning a lecture.
A lecture, yeah.
About cold brew and various business applications and how the sensory of cold brew can really impact the flavors in the cup that you serve your guests.
Yeah.
Yep. I want to jump in with that. Like you mentioned Christmas morning, like delivering research. I guess that makes me Santa Claus. I'm not sure. But it's really gratifying for us too, because like my background again is chemical engineering. My thesis was on colloidal nanoparticles, and talking to a small room of experts. What's really unique about the coffee industry, and was something that really drew me to it very strongly, was how eager people were for science and coffee. And it's really gratifying. I go give a lecture at the SCA Expo. It's like 200 people in the room. Like, it was really fascinated by the coffee and fascinated by what we're doing. That's a really rewarding experience for us as well. So I really enjoy.
Yeah. Well, and any of you can present, flesh out your lectures, your workshops, your conversations with your team, your customers with this data. And that's, it's not just for the students who are publishing the work or the university or the Coffee Science Foundation or the funding partner. It's for everybody to really enhance our understanding.
Yeah, great. Okay, so what's next? We're at this point, we've started, as you said, there's 3 things published, more on the way. Let's talk about what's coming a little bit. These are some ideas that came to my mind. Research-based educational resources. So SCA and SCA does a big research program, educational program through our AST network. And so, we can start to integrate this. This is part of my job now, is to figure out how to integrate this into the educational materials that we publish and the educational classes that SCA trainers do. Maybe we can start to publish it into something like a handbook. We talked about standards yesterday, and this is one thing that's I think really important, is that you heard Mario talking about some of the challenges of standards making, which is part of SCA's responsibility to make standards, and you can make standards based on anything, including anecdote, including poor quality evidence. But SCA wants to make standards that are based on good quality evidence. And so, it's possible now. We've got, through Bill's work and Julia's support, we've got all this information now. And now, for the first time, we can imagine setting some standards around cold brew, like some definitions around cold brew, what it actually is, because we have some measurements that could support such an insight and help us solve some of those consumer confusion issues that are around what is cold brew? Is it even a marketing thing? And we can say, no. We've got some standards around what cold brew is. It's this kind of temperature and this kind of concentration and this kind of flavor and this kind of color, maybe. And that's something that might be in the future for us here. And then finally, we can start to think about future research. What do you think about that, Julie and Bill?
Let me answer that first, if you don't mind. I noticed at the end of every presentation, and maybe it's just science protocol, is what else do we what do we want to do next, or what's missing, or and every time there's like, well, we learned all these things, but we don't know these things, or we discovered these great features, scientific data, and it turns out that's pushing us to ask more questions. And it's always the end of the presentation where I'm like, but it's like, so it seems like there's so much that we were able to learn, and it revealed almost like a whole other, like a whole other curtain was pulled of, and these are the things that we now know we need to learn about. So, I think there's a lot of additional research that is worth exploring.
Absolutely. I mean, so I think the best science is the science that reveals the questions that you didn't know you had in the first place.
Right.
So, and I'm having a lot of fun learning new questions in coffee and want to tackle more.
Yeah.
And as a person who's, I like to say I'm a sciencey person, but not a scientist. I didn't know that that's the best science. And so I thought, we'd do this project and we'd have all sorts of data and findings, and we'd tie it up in a little bow. And I had no idea that we would end up with more questions than when we started.
Yeah. And that's the amazing thing. I think that's what keeps me thrilled about science and this constant idea that there's always more to learn, and there's more information out there that we can get, and things that we don't. There's even more that we don't know yet, And once we investigate the next things that we've revealed, then they will reveal even more things, and that's how we expand our knowledge. And it seems clear to me that from where we stand now, today, here in 2023, reflecting on cold brew, both what's happened in the market and what we've learned in the scientific investigation, is that there are really good reasons that cold brew is where it is in the marketplace, has really set its place, I know that I've grown in my appreciation of cold brew over the past decade, a lot, and now I see it as as an equivalent kind of extraction technique, right, along with filter coffee and espresso. Those are the main two things that we've always thought about as our two main coffee preparation techniques. And now I really do think of cold brew coffee as a unique extraction technique, even separately from its utility as a source for cold beverages, which I love, iced coffee and cold drinks and stuff. I love those, and I love cold brews around that. But also as a way to produce coffee that can be served at any temperature, That's one thing that Julie has really taught me, is that cold brew is temperature agnostic, just because you in terms of serving temperature agnosticism. If you brew it cold, you can still serve it warm or hot or or other things, and it's the cold brewedness of it that really create these flavor opportunities that we saw in the research.
And the chemical composition differences allows it to be a very suitable product for a lot of us in the coffee industry who want something that's going to taste the same hours, days, in some cases weeks later, in which you just couldn't do before with hot extraction. And I think that's been one of the main reasons why cold brew took off in the industry. It created a really incredible growth opportunity for so many businesses. And understanding why does it not taste stale? And why is it that a hot brewed cup of coffee tastes so amazing right when it's brewed, but tastes sour and bitter hours later? And why does that not happen with cold brew? So there's a lot still to explore.
So here's some key takeaways from us today, and we've touched on them already, but I want to dwell on the last one, which we haven't discussed yet, but which I think is really important, which is one thing that we've proved that has really nothing to do with cold brew itself, but is a lesson nonetheless, I think, for me, which is that we've demonstrated that food science writ large, in general, can be used at the pre-competitive level. So, Julia provided this support pre-competitively. This is the term that we use. And pre-competitive means you're not using it you're not investing in competitive research, you're investing in research that anybody can use. And so this is a pre-competitive research project. And it's a demonstration of how pre-competitive scientific investigation can be used and is practical as a tool for us in the industry to solve industry problems. And we're faced with other problems besides misinformation about cold brew, which is an important one, but there are other problems that we're faced with. We talked about value yesterday, we talked about climate change yesterday. We can all think of a million problems that we're facing as an industry, but I'm just thrilled, and I'm very grateful to both of you for demonstrating that this kind of model works for solving problems in the industry, and that when you've got an entrepreneur that has some vision and some risk tolerance and a willingness to invest, that the outputs can be meaningful and tangible for the scientific community and also for the coffee community. So thank you for that. Okay, I've told you a few times already that we make all these publications and outputs available. If you URL that, you'll go to a page that has all of the academic publications linked to, all of the plain language publications linked to, some videos that we've made over the years, et cetera, et cetera. That page will continue to populate as more things come out. We're probably, as Bill, I don't know if you heard him mention that it's about to kind of skyrocket here, the number of outputs.
Jesse's about to publish 4 more papers.
Yeah.
My goal.
Yeah.
So we'll make that happen.
So all of those will appear on that same page. So keep an eye on that. That's the landing page for the Coffee Science Foundation and this project. So please keep an eye on that as things continue to come out.
Well, and I also want to say thank you, Peter, for all of your work in putting this together. We wouldn't have had an opportunity to pull this off were it not for the Coffee Science Foundation, and you were honestly taking that opportunity in Rico's Symposium in 2016 to start answering, being courageous enough to answer some of these, to ask the questions that we're finally getting to answer now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I should jump in and say thank you to both of you for taking a chance on UC Davis in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah.
So I think it's paid off, and so.
All right, thanks everyone.
Yeah.